right. So today we're diving deep into a case that's got it all. Gang activity, legal strategy, and some seriously high stakes.
Oh, yeah. This one's fascinating.
We're looking at Clarence Heatley and John Cuff. And for our listeners who haven't heard of them, they were both part of the Preacher Crew.
Yeah, a pretty notorious gang. They were involved in a lot of criminal activity. I mean, we're talking murder, robbery, extortion, drug trafficking, the whole 9 yards.
And Heatley, who also went by the alias Preacher, was the leader.
That's right. And get this. Between Heatley, Cuff, and 10 other members of the gang, they were hit with a whopping 86 counts.
86. Wow.
That gives you an idea of the scale of their operation.
Yeah.
The government was definitely not messing around.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you consider that both Heatley and Cuff were facing the death penalty.
Exactly. The government had filed notices of intent to seek the death penalty against both of them.
So that brings us to the big question. Knowing that they were potentially facing execution, why would they take plea deals?
Well, you have to imagine the kind of pressure they were under.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, facing the possibility of execution, it's a lot to process.
Yeah.
And their lawyers probably advised them that a plea deal was their best shot at avoiding that outcome.
Yeah, a classic risk-reward situation.
Exactly.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Part of their plea deal involved waiving their right to appeal.
Yeah. They essentially traded the chance of ever being free for the certainty of avoiding the death penalty.
Which brings up a whole host of ethical questions, right? I mean, what happens if new evidence emerges later on? Or if someone is pressured into taking a plea deal, even if they're innocent?
Absolutely. It really makes you think about the balance between efficiency in the legal system and making sure individual rights are protected.
No easy answers there.
Nope. But let's get back to Heatley and Cuff. Because even though they took those plea deals, they later tried to challenge their convictions.
They did.
Yep. Heatley argued he had ineffective assistance of counsel, meaning he felt his lawyers didn't do a good job representing him. He also brought up some procedural issues with the case. Cuff went even further.
Oh.
Yeah. He claimed ineffective assistance of counsel too, but he also argued that some of the charges against him didn't involve interstate commerce, so the federal court shouldn't have had jurisdiction.
Oh, wow.
And then on top of that, he threw in accusations of prosecutorial misconduct and selective prosecution, like he was pulling out all the stops.
Sounds like he was trying everything he could think of.
He was. But before we get into how the court responded to all of that, let's talk about what they actually pleaded guilty to.
Okay, yeah. What were the specifics?
Well, Heatley admitted to participating in 13 murders and 1 attempted murder.
13 murders.
Yeah. And during his plea allocution, which is basically a formal statement in court where you admit your guilt, he gave some pretty chilling details, like how he ordered hits on people, engaged in robberies, extortion, even arson.
That's a lot to take in. And what about Cuff? What did he plead guilty to?
He confessed to his role in 11 murders, all carried out on behalf of the Preacher Crew.
Wow. It's clear these weren't just small-time offenses.
Absolutely not. This was serious, organized crime, and their confessions really painted a picture of how brutal the Preacher Crew's operations actually were.
So we've got these two guys, both admitting to horrific crimes to avoid the death penalty, and then they turn around and try to get their convictions overturned. What did the court think about all this?
Well, before we get to the court's decision, there's this really fascinating legal concept that comes into play here, the dual sovereignty principle. And this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
All right, so the dual sovereignty principle. So the dual sovereignty principle, it basically means that both the state and federal governments can prosecute someone for the same conduct without it being considered double jeopardy.
Hold on, so you're saying someone could be tried and convicted in state court,
Yeah.
and then the feds could turn around and try them again for the same exact thing. I don't get it. How's that not double jeopardy?
Yeah, it seems kind of counterintuitive. But the key is that state and federal governments, they're seen as separate sovereign entities, right? Each with their own set of laws. It's kind of like two different referees calling fouls in the same game.
Okay, so they each have their own area they control.
Exactly.
But then doesn't that mean someone could essentially get punished twice for the same crime?
Yeah, it's a valid concern for sure. There's actually this famous Supreme Court case, United States versus Lanza, where a guy was convicted in both state and federal court for the same act. He was selling illegal liquor.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court, they upheld it. They basically said, look, state and federal governments often have different interests that they're trying to protect.
So thinking about the Preacher Crew, could Heatley and Cuff Could they have faced separate charges in state court for those murders, even after being convicted in federal court?
Oh, absolutely. See, the federal government was focused on racketeering and other federal offenses, but the state, they could have gone after them for murder under their own laws.
So they really could have been tried twice for the same killings.
Yeah. It gets complicated.
Definitely. But there has to be some limit to this dual sovereignty thing, right? What if it's obvious that one government is just trying to tack on extra charges after the other one already went after them?
You're right. There is an exception. It's called the sham and cover exception. Basically, if one sovereign is just acting as a puppet for the other, just trying to skirt around double jeopardy, then that second prosecution might get thrown out.
So, like, if the feds were pulling the strings to get a state prosecutor to go after someone they'd already convicted, that wouldn't fly.
Exactly. The court's been pretty clear that that kind of collusion, trying to sneak in a second prosecution that's basically just a do-over of the first one, it's not allowed.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But I bet it's pretty hard to prove that kind of like behind-the-scenes stuff.
Yeah, you're not wrong. It's a high bar to clear, this sham and cover exception. The courts want to see solid evidence of bad faith, real collusion between the governments.
Did Heatley try to use this sham and cover argument in his case?
He didn't. And from the information we have, there's no indication that there was any prior state prosecution for these crimes, let alone any hint of collusion.
Okay, so back to Heatley and Cuff trying to overturn their convictions. What did the court ultimately decide?
They denied both of their petitions.
Denied? Why?
A couple of key points. First, they pointed out that Heatley's own statements during his plea allocution, remember, where he admitted guilt, those statements directly contradicted his later claims that his counsel was ineffective. He clearly admitted guilt and said he understood the charges.
So his own words came back to bite him.
Pretty much. And the court also made a point of saying that both Heatley and Cuff, they specifically waived their right to appeal or file these types of petitions when they signed those plea agreements. They knew what they were giving up.
But what about Cuff's argument about not appealing earlier because of issues with his lawyers? Didn't that give him some grounds to challenge it later?
The court addressed that too. They basically said Cuff hadn't shown a good enough reason for not appealing when he had the opportunity. He dissed his window, and this later petition couldn't change that.
So, tough luck for Cuff.
Basically, they stuck to the idea that plea agreements, they're binding contracts. You can't just try to undo them later on without a very compelling reason, which neither Heatley nor Cuff had.
So in the end, despite trying everything they could, they were stuck with what they had agreed to.
Yeah. Life sentences without parole. And they had used up all their legal options. The court's decision really hammered home the serious nature of those plea bargains and the whole idea of, finality in the legal system.
It's a lot to think about. It shows how tough those choices can be when the stakes are so high.
Yeah.
And it highlights how complex the justice system can be, all those gray areas.
For sure. It's not just a story about a couple of criminals and their punishment. It's a way to look at how our justice system works, how we balance individual rights with making the system run smoothly.
It really makes you think about the bigger picture, right? Like, we see these awful crimes,
Right.
and of course we want justice to be served. But then there's all these, legal procedures, and while I get why they exist, they definitely raise some questions.
Absolutely. It's not just a story about these two guys, Heatley and Cuff. I mean, it makes you think about how the whole justice system works. How do we balance, being fair to everyone and making sure the system functions properly?
Yeah, those plea agreements. They were so important to what happened to these guys. And I get it, from a practical point of view. Imagine if every single person who took a plea deal could later appeal it.
Oh, the courts would be completely swamped.
Totally. So plea bargains are like a tool, right?
Yeah, they help manage all the cases. But as we talked about, they also have these ethical implications. Like, when you waive your right to appeal in a plea deal, you're giving up something pretty fundamental, legally speaking.
It's like you're losing a safety net. And what really gets me is the potential for coercion. Think about being Heatley and Cuff, facing execution, under pressure, maybe scared for their lives, even in prison. Did they really choose that plea deal? Or did they feel like they had no other option?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's hard to know what was going on in their minds, but there's definitely a power dynamic there, right, when you're bargaining with the state. I mean, there are rules to prevent someone from being forced into a plea, but the possibility of pressure, even subtle pressure, it's there.
And then there's the whole dual sovereignty thing. It's fascinating from, a legal standpoint. But it's like, can someone really be punished twice for the same thing? I mean, theoretically, someone could do their time in federal prison and then get hit with another trial and another sentence in state court for the same actions.
Right, and it does feel kind of unfair on the surface, but the courts have said time and time again that this separation between state and federal, it matters. They have different powers and interests. The important thing, like you said before, is to make sure this dual sovereignty idea isn't being used, just to pile on charges or to get revenge.
A lot of nuances there.
Yeah.
This case really shows how complex things can be, all the moving parts.
Yeah.
So what are the big takeaways for our listeners? What should they keep in mind?
I think the biggest one is to be skeptical. It's easy to just take what happens in court as like the final word. But this case really shows how important it is to look deeper, to think about the process, about whether things were fair or not.
To question everything. Basically.
Exactly. This case, it's not just about two guys. It's about how our whole legal system works. And the more we know about how it works, the better we can push for fairness and hold the people in power accountable.
This deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about. From gang violence to plea bargains to dual sovereignty. Behind every case, there are these human stories, these complicated questions that are worth talking about.
I couldn't agree more. And for everyone listening, I hope this encourages you to learn more about these issues, to ask questions, to have these important conversations about how we can make our legal system fairer for everybody.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a wild ride.
My pleasure.
All right, so today we're diving deep into Memphis.
Ooh, Memphis.
Yeah, we're going to uncover the story of Craig Petty's.
Okay.
And, you might not know the name right off the bat.
Yeah.
But this guy, he built a drug empire that stretched all the way down to Mexico.
Wow.
It's a story about ambition and power and some really, really tough choices.
Sounds intense.
It is intense. Are you ready to get started?
Absolutely, I am. What I think is so fascinating about Petty's is that it's not just like a typical rise to power. It's really about the connections between poverty and opportunity and, just that allure of easy money.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's rewind back to the beginning.
Okay.
Our sources paint this picture of Petty's childhood in Riverside, Memphis.
Okay.
It was the 80s. And this was a neighborhood riddled with poverty.
Right.
Not really a place where dreams come true,
Not an easy place to grow up, for sure.
And he was exposed to crime from a young age.
Yeah.
Like even as a teenager, he was already in trouble with the law.
Right.
And I think these early encounters really reveal a pattern of this rebelliousness and lack of impulse control.
Yeah, definitely. And we're not just talking about like petty theft here.
No.
At 15, Petty's is caught with a sawed-off shotgun.
Wow.
Yeah, he said he needed it for protection.
Yeah.
And then just a year later, he's charged with attempted murder after shooting a rival.
That escalated quickly.
It did. It really did. And this is where that psychologist's evaluation becomes so important.
Right.
They noted a low verbal IQ and that rebelliousness we talked about and a serious lack of impulse control.
Right.
So you combine all of those factors with his environment and it really, you can see how things kind of went the way they did.
Yeah. So how did those specific traits, the low verbal IQ, the impulsiveness play out in those early crimes, and even his later leadership style?
That's a really good question. So the impulsiveness that might explain, that quick escalation to violence.
Yeah.
But his low verbal IQ doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't intelligent. It just means that he might have struggled with expressing himself conventionally.
Yeah.
He might have relied more on actions than words.
Oh, interesting.
And that could be seen in his leadership later on. He wasn't a super charismatic speaker, rallying troops.
Right.
But he was decisive and he was ruthless in his actions, which unfortunately resonated with his followers.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it that way.
Yeah.
So it's this mix of nature and nurture that's shaping him, right?
Absolutely.
And then at 18, there's this huge turning point.
Okay.
Petty's gets involved in this scheme to steal $500,000 from an impounded car.
Whoa, okay.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money.
It is. And that theft was a catalyst.
It was.
It gave him the capital to get into the drug trade on a much larger scale.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was like he had the resources to match his ambition.
Yeah.
And from there, He climbs the ladder fast.
He did.
He becomes a major player in the Gangster Disciples,
Okay.
which is this powerful street gang out of Chicago. And he eventually heads up their Memphis branch,
Wow.
which gives him control over this vast network.
Yeah.
And his business sense was sharp. He was outselling all his rivals,
He was,
reinvesting the profits to expand the operation.
he was like a twisted entrepreneur in a way.
Yeah.
He wasn't content with just the local market. He had much bigger plans.
Oh, yeah. By his early 20s, he's living large, fancy house, luxury cars, even property in Las Vegas.
Wow.
Yeah, expensive taste.
He did. He definitely did. Which, begs the question, how did this young man from such a tough background make the connections to build this type of empire?
Yeah.
This is where the Mexican cartel comes in.
Okay.
So Petty's wasn't content with just marijuana.
Right.
He wanted to move into cocaine. And to do that, he needed a serious supplier.
Right.
So he reaches out to Edgar Valdez Villarreal,
Okay.
also known as La Barbie.
La Barbie.
Yeah, who was a high-ranking member of the notorious Beltran-Leyva cartel.
Wow, that's a whole different level.
It is. What made this partnership possible?
Yeah, because wasn't there a huge risk for the cartel in working with an American?
Right. So at that time, the Beltran-Leyva cartel, they were vying for power. They were looking to expand their influence.
Right.
And they were known for their brutal tactics and willingness to break from tradition.
Okay.
Partnering with Petty's was unprecedented.
Yeah.
A Black American accepted into a powerful Mexican cartel.
Wow.
It was a game changer.
Yeah, I had no idea that a connection like that was even possible.
It really was.
So we're talking next level stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It gave Petty's access to massive amounts of cocaine and a distribution network that stretched across the entire U.S.
Oh, wow.
And it gave the cartel a foothold in new markets. It was a
Right.
win-win for both of them in a way.
So this is more than just a local drug operation now. This is international.
It is.
We're talking tons of marijuana, hundreds of kilos of cocaine, millions of dollars flowing back to Mexico.
Millions.
Yeah. Petty's also had ties to the Black Mafia family in Detroit, supplying them with cocaine. This guy was weaving a web of criminal connections all across the country.
A criminal mastermind for
Yeah.
sure. But, with that level of success comes incredible risk.
Right.
And in 2002, a major drug bust leads to Petty's indictment.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, he knew the feds were onto him.
So he disappears? He goes to Mexico?
As he pulls a disappearing act and seeks refuge with his powerful allies in the cartel.
Right.
And that's when his story takes a much darker turn.
Okay.
He's living this life of luxury under their protection,
Right.
but he's also becoming more and more ruthless.
So let's unpack that.
Yeah.
He's living the high life.
He is.
But at what cost?
Well, the cost is steep.
Hmm.
Influenced by the cartel's methods, Petty starts ordering hits on anyone he sees as a threat.
So anyone.
Yeah, anyone. And we're not just talking about rivals or enemies.
Right.
He even ordered the death of his own cousin, Antonio Allen.
What?
Yeah, who he's suspected of being an informant.
Wow, that's gold.
It's incredibly cold. It just shows how far Petty's was willing to go to keep his power and control. The violence wasn't just about eliminating threats. It was about sending a message.
Wow. This is where the story gets really chilling. We need to talk about some of these other murders that Petty's ordered.
Right.
But before we do, let's take a quick moment to reflect on what we've learned so far.
Yeah.
This story, it's full of twists and turns.
It is.
And we're just getting started.
I know, crazy, right?
It is crazy.
It's really a stark reminder of how power can corrupt. I mean, the deeper Petty's got into this world, the more desensitized he became to the violence.
Yeah. And it wasn't just Antonio Allen. He also ordered the deaths of Latrell Small and Kalonji Griffin.
Right.
Small had actually impersonated a police officer to rob one of Petty's associates.
Oh, wow.
Pretty bold move considering who he's messing with.
Yeah, a fatal mistake.
It was.
Petty saw any challenge to his authority, no matter how small as a threat, that had to be eliminated.
Yeah.
I mean, these murders were a way to enforce his code of silence.
Right. So it's not even about the drugs anymore.
No.
It's about power and control through fear and intimidation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for a while it worked. Petty's empire thrived. He was living it up in Mexico, orchestrating murders, shipping drugs by the ton. He was basically untouchable.
Until he wasn't.
Right.
In 2008, a massive raid on his Mexican hideout brought his reign to a very dramatic end.
It did.
We're talking snipers, helicopters,
Yeah.
Mexican military swarming his home. It sounds like an action movie.
It does. It was a major operation, a real testament to the cooperation between U.S. and Mexican authorities.
Yeah.
I mean, capturing Petty's was a huge win in the fight against international drug trafficking.
But even when cornered, Petty's was still a master strategist.
Oh, yeah.
He knew he was facing serious charges.
Right.
Possibly even the death penalty.
Wow. So he struck a deal.
He did.
He agreed to cooperate with the authorities
In exchange for
the safety of his children.
Oh, wow.
They had been born in Mexico under assumed identities.
That's a shrewd move. It shows even facing a possible life sentence, he was still thinking about his family's future.
It's a complex situation, you know.
On one hand, you have this ruthless criminal mastermind.
Right.
On the other hand, you have a father willing to sacrifice his freedom for his children.
Yeah. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about the guy.
It does. It reminds you that even in these dark corners of the criminal world, there's still shades of humanity.
There is.
So Petty starts talking, giving authorities this glimpse into the inner workings of his organization.
Okay.
And its connections to the cartel. But there's this chilling quote where he says,
What's that?
referring to the Sinaloa cartel, he says, "Wherever you put me, they'll kill me."
Wow. That statement really highlights the power and reach of these cartels. Even behind bars, Petty's didn't feel safe. His cooperation had made him a target.
Yeah. After years of investigations and numerous arrests, Petty's case finally goes to trial in 2013.
Okay.
He pleads guilty to 19 charges,
Wow.
including drug trafficking, racketeering,
Right.
money laundering, and of course, murder.
Yeah.
The judge sentenced him to 9 life sentences without parole.
9 life sentences.
Right.
That really puts the scale of his crimes into perspective.
It does. And it wasn't just Petty's. This massive investigation led to the conviction of 40 individuals connected to his organization.
Wow. 40.
Yeah. Key associates like Clarence Brody, his enforcer, and the Lewis cousins, who were basically his right-hand men, they all received significant prison sentences.
They did.
Even Edgar Valdez Villarreal, Petty's cartel contact, was captured and sentenced to 49 years.
Wow.
So it was a sweeping crackdown that dismantled this network that had operated with impunity for years.
It's important to note, though, that these convictions were only possible because people within Petty's own organization cooperated.
Yeah.
It just shows how important witness testimony is in breaking down these huge criminal enterprises.
So the empire crumbles. Petty's and his crew are behind bars. Case closed.
Right.
But it's not that simple, is it?
No, it's not. Petty's legacy is much more complicated than that.
Right.
I mean, his story raises some important questions about the systems that create criminals like him. You have to think about the poverty he was born into, the lack of opportunities, the allure of easy money in a community struggling with drugs and violence.
It's true. It's like a cycle that's almost impossible to break.
It is.
You can't just focus on punishment. You have to address the root causes.
Absolutely. We need to talk about the systemic issues that lead people to choose a life of crime.
So it's more than just a true crime story.
Yeah.
It's a reflection of some deeper societal problems.
It is. And that's what makes this case so fascinating and thought-provoking. It's not just about one man, it's about understanding the complexities of the world we live in.
Okay, so connecting this back to the listener, what can they take away from this deep dive into Craig Petty's world?
Yeah, it makes you wonder, what if things had been different for him?
Yeah.
What if he had grown up in a safer neighborhood,
Right.
had more opportunities,
Mhm.
maybe even had some positive role models? Could his path have been different?
It's a question that comes up a lot, when studying these kinds of cases.
Yeah.
We can't change the past, but we can definitely learn from it.
In Petty's story, I think it emphasizes the need for programs that help young people,
Yeah.
especially those in struggling communities.
Yeah.
Things like early intervention, better education and strong community support systems, those can make a huge difference.
Yeah.
They can provide alternatives to a life of crime.
It really does take a village.
It does.
But what happens when the village itself is in trouble? When poverty and violence are just everyday life, it's a vicious cycle.
It is, and that's why it's so important to tackle these issues head on.
Yeah.
You have to invest in struggling communities, create jobs, and provide resources that empower people to make positive choices.
Right.
It's not just about punishing crime, it's about preventing it.
Exactly. So connecting this back to you, the listener, I think Petty's story is a powerful reminder that our choices have consequences.
Yeah.
Not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us.
Mm-hmm.
It also challenges us to really think about the systems we live in
Right.
and ask ourselves, what can we do to make society fairer and more just?
I completely agree. I think Petty's life, as tragic as it was, can be a catalyst for change.
Yeah.
By understanding the complexities of his story, we can start to untangle, all the factors that contribute to crime and work towards creating a future where stories like his are the exception, not the norm.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. We've only scratched the surface of this really complex world. Now it's your turn to keep exploring. Ask those tough questions. Challenge your own perspectives. And remember, knowledge is power, but it's what you do with that knowledge that really matters.
All right, so today we're diving deep, really deep into the life of David Barksdale.
A name that's pretty much synonymous with Chicago gang history, you could say.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you can't really talk about one without the other, can you? And we're going right to the source with this one, using an excerpt from his Wikipedia page.
Which always comes with its own set of caveats, right?
Oh, absolutely. Especially with a figure like a Barksdale, there's going to be, well, let's just say there are a few issues flagged on this particular page.
Oh, that's right. Issues.
Makes you wonder what we're going to find, doesn't it? So where do we even begin with a guy like David Barksdale? Well, the story starts down south, Mississippi to be exact. Denise David Barksdale, born into a family of, get this, 13 children.
Wow, 13 kids. That's a full house.
Yeah, no kidding. But the family didn't stay in Mississippi. They packed up and moved to Chicago in 57.
57, huh? That's a big change, going from rural Mississippi to the heart of Chicago, especially back then.
Huge, right? Chicago was a whole different world. The city was booming, lots of industrial growth, but also a ton of social tension brewing under the surface.
Yeah, I can see how that kind of environment could create a breeding ground for figures like Barksdale.
And rise he did. Here's the thing. Just 3 years after arriving in Chicago at the age of 15, Barksdale was already known as a gang leader. 15 years old.
That's incredible. I mean, what do you think it was about him, or maybe about that time period, that allowed someone that young to rise up so fast in that world?
It's a good question, right? It's like, what makes someone a leader in that kind of environment? He must have had some serious charisma or maybe a knack for, I don't know, strategy.
Yeah, maybe a bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
But you also got to remember the social context. Back in those neighborhoods, there wasn't a lot of, traditional support systems. So gangs, they offered a sense of belonging, a kind of twisted sense of community.
It's like they filled a void in a way.
Right, exactly.
Huh?
Especially for young people who felt like they were being ignored or left behind,
Yeah, I get that. So fast forward a few years to 1966. Barksdale's gang, they'd been absorbing all these smaller groups. And by then they were known as, get this, the Black Disciple Nation.
Nation, huh? That's a pretty bold statement.
It was more than just a gang at that point. It was an organization with structure, hierarchy, almost like a paramilitary group or something.
Yeah, it's a different level of organization.
Yeah.
And with that came more power, more control, more influence in those neighborhoods.
More money, too, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It wasn't just about turf wars anymore.
Yeah.
These gangs, they were running businesses, protection rackets, getting involved in drug trafficking. The stakes were much higher.
And, of course, that meant more violence, and there was a lot of it, especially with rival gangs like the Blackstone Rangers. But then, here's where things get interesting. Barksdale, despite being right in the middle of all this, he starts talking about peace.
Really? Peace?
Yeah. He actually proposes a merger in 1973 with Larry Hoover, the leader of the Supreme Gangsters.
Wow. That's a pretty unexpected move coming from a guy known for leading a powerful and, let's be honest, sometimes violent organization.
Yeah, it's like, is this a genuine desire for peace, or is it some kind of strategic power play? What do you think?
It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe he saw the damage that all the fighting was doing to his community. Maybe he was looking for a way out. Or maybe he saw it as a way to consolidate power, create an even bigger, more dominant force.
It could be a little of both, right? The idealist and the pragmatist all rolled into one.
Yeah, maybe. But regardless of his motivations, the merger did happen. They formed the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, a whole new chapter.
And that brings us back to Barksdale, the individual, because there's this one detail in the Wikipedia article that really jumped out at me. It says he was arrested 25 times.
25 times?
But never convicted of a serious offense.
Wow, that's pretty remarkable for a guy in his position. How do you explain that?
I don't know, maybe he was just incredibly good at working the system, or maybe he had connections, people on the inside looking out for him.
Yeah, or maybe he was just lucky. Who knows?
Or maybe he was playing a different game altogether. The article also mentions that he used an alias, David Jones.
An alias.
Interesting. It makes you wonder, was he trying to fly under the radar? create a separate identity or maybe even distance himself from the increasingly dangerous world he was a part of.
Yeah, it adds another layer to the whole mystery, doesn't it? Like,
Yeah.
who was the real David Barksdale? Was he the feared gang leader, the peacemaker, the savvy operator? Or was it all just a carefully constructed facade?
It's easy to get lost in all the talk of gangs and power struggles, but we gotta remember we're talking about a real person here, a guy with a family, with a life outside of all that.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, the Wikipedia excerpt, it mentions his wife, Yvonne Yarber,
Oh, yeah.
and their 3 kids.
Huh. So they had a family. I wonder what that was like for them, living with, everything that came with Barksdale's lifestyle.
Well, it definitely wasn't easy. One of their sons, he was actually killed in '96 by a member of the Gangster Disciples.
Oh, wow. The Gangster Disciples, that's the group Barksdale helped create when he merged with Larry Hoover.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, even when you try to escape the violence, it can still come back to haunt you.
That's heavy. And what about Yvonne? What happened to her?
Well, sadly, she was murdered too, just a few years after Barksdale died.
It's like their family was trapped in this cycle of violence that they just couldn't break free from.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the lasting impact of those choices, how they can ripple outward and affect generations.
It's a tragic story for sure. When we were talking about those issues flagged on the Wikipedia page, one thing that really caught my eye was the account of the assassination attempt on Barksdale back in 1970.
Yeah, what about it?
Well, it's just so incredibly detailed. Like, it mentions the attackers were armed with M14 rifles, even gives the exact address of the bar where it happened.
I mean, that does sound pretty specific.
It's almost like too specific, Makes me wonder if it's all completely accurate or if some of it's been, I don't know, embellished over time.
Yeah, you always have to be careful with these kinds of accounts,
Yeah.
especially when they rely on memories, which can fade or get distorted over the years.
So how do we even know what to believe? I mean, how do we separate fact from fiction when it comes to a guy like Barksdale? It's like we're trying to solve a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing.
That's the challenge, isn't it? We have to look for corroborating evidence. Try to cross-reference different sources, see if the details line up.
Like police reports, newspaper articles, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And even then, there might be gaps in the information, conflicting accounts, biases we need to be aware of.
It's like playing detective, right? Trying to piece together the truth from all these scattered fragments.
That's a good way to put it. And even with all that effort, we might never have the complete picture. But the process of searching, that's what's important.
It's about the journey, huh?
Exactly. It's about asking questions, being critical, and always being open to new information that might challenge our assumptions.
Thinking about Barksdale's story, it's hard not to see it as a product of its time. You know what I mean? Like what was happening in Chicago back then, socially and politically, that might have contributed to his rise and to the rise of gang activity in general.
We have to remember, Chicago in the 60s and 70s, it was a city in transition. Lots of racial tension, poverty, inequality.
So those conditions kind of created this perfect storm for gangs to take root.
Yeah, exactly. For a lot of young people, especially in Black communities, gangs offered a sense of belonging, a way to make money, a way to exert power in a world that felt stacked against them.
It's like they provided a twisted sense of opportunity that wasn't available through traditional channels.
Right. And Barksdale, with his charisma, his
Yeah.
leadership skills, he was able to tap into that, to create a structure, an organization that gave those young people a sense of purpose, even if that purpose was ultimately destructive.
So he was both a product of his environment and a shaper of it. It's like it all kind of feeds back into itself, this cycle of poverty, violence, and despair.
Yeah, it's a complex web of factors.
Yeah.
And Barksdale's story, it reflects that complexity. It's a reminder that historical figures, even the ones who did bad things, they weren't operating in a vacuum. They were influenced by the world around them.
That's a really good point. It's not about excusing their actions, but it's about understanding the context, the forces that shaped them. And that brings us to the question of legacy. You mentioned earlier that the Black disciples still celebrate Barksdale's birthday, right?
Yeah, they do, every year. It's a big event for them.
But how do we reconcile that with the fact that he was a criminal? I mean, some people see him as a hero, a community leader, while others see him as a villain, a symbol of violence and destruction.
It's a tough question, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do you deal with a legacy that's so complicated, so full of contradictions?
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher, right? How do you make sense of a guy who is both a leader and, let's be real, involved in some pretty serious criminal activity?
It's a tough one, for sure.
I mean, it's not about saying what he did was okay, but trying to understand, the whole picture, the choices people make when they're in that world.
It's about nuance, right?
But
You can acknowledge the damage that gang violence causes, the lives lost, the communities torn apart. But you also have to recognize that these stories are never simple.
like we were saying before, it's those shades of gray.
Exactly.
Barksdale might have been involved in crime, but he also wanted peace. He tried to find common ground between these rival gangs. And don't forget, he had a family. He was a part of this community. It's all got to be considered.
And I think those contradictions, that's what makes these historical figures so interesting, It reminds us that people aren't just one thing. They're capable of both good and bad.
So how do we approach these legacies then? Do we focus on the negative, the harm that was done? Or do we try to find those moments of hope, those times when someone tried to make things better, even if they didn't completely succeed?
I think it's about seeing the whole person, the good and the bad, the successes and the failures, getting the full context, understanding the social forces at play, the choices they made, and what happened because of those choices.
It's about remembering that these figures were human beings, not just characters in some story. They were shaped by their circumstances, by the time they lived in cities.
Exactly. And I think that understanding can help us grapple with these bigger issues, things like poverty, inequality, the systems that keep these cycles of violence going.
It's about finding ways to break those cycles, right?
Right.
To build a world where everyone has a fair shot.
Absolutely. That's the goal.
So Barksdale's life, even though it ended tragically, I think it can be a lesson for us, a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition, the terrible consequences of violence, but also a reminder that there's always hope for change, this desire for something better.
Yeah, even in the darkest parts of history, there are lessons to be learned, opportunities to grow, and to understand things better.
And those lessons are so relevant today. We're still struggling with a lot of the same problems: poverty, inequality, violence.
Yeah, it's like we haven't fully learned from the past.
What do you think Barksdale's story can teach us about dealing with these challenges now, in the present?
I think it shows how important it is to fix the things that cause these problems in the first place, We got to invest in communities, create opportunities for young people, give them a real alternative to gang life.
Yeah, it can't just be about punishment. It's got to be about prevention, too, right? Addressing the root causes of violence instead of just reacting to it after it happens.
Absolutely. Things like education, job training, mental health services, and programs that bring communities together, that give people a sense of hope and belonging.
It's about creating a world where kids don't feel like they have to join a gang to find those things.
That's the dream, right?
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the life of David Barksdale, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this? What can we learn from this complicated and, let's be honest, pretty disturbing story?
I think it forces us to really examine how we view the past, to understand that people are complex, and even in the darkest parts of our history, there are things we can learn from, opportunities to become better.
It's a call to action, right? It's a reminder that we have to learn from what's happened before, to work towards a future that's fairer and more just, to break these cycles of violence that have gone on for far too long.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thanks for joining us on this journey through the life and times of David Barksdale. Hopefully it's given you some things to think about, maybe even inspired you to do something to make a difference. Until next time, keep digging deeper, keep asking questions, and keep trying to understand this crazy world we live in. All right, so get ready, because today we're diving deep into the story of Sly Green.
Sly Green.
A notorious gangster, whose legacy is intertwined with the world of hip hop.
Yeah.
Kind of wild. We're going to look at his rise to power as the head of the LA Boys, his dramatic downfall,
Right.
and his unexpected presence in music today.
Yeah.
And all through the lens of
It's a really...
some articles and research that you've shared.
Yeah, what's super interesting about Sly Green is that his story is not just like a typical gangster tale. That it makes you think about how we're so fascinated by these crime figures and how their stories get told and retold, especially in music.
Yeah, for sure. It's a unique situation.
Definitely.
For those who might not know, Sly Green was the leader of the LA Boys gang. And back in the 80s and 90s, they basically controlled the drug trade in Buffalo, New York.
That's right.
They had this reputation for being ruthless and powerful,
Yeah.
which made them almost legendary in the criminal world.
And that reputation wasn't just hype. Their name, the LA Boys, actually gives you a clue about how big their operation was.
Oh, how so?
They were getting their drugs straight from Los Angeles,
Wow.
which shows just how ambitious and far-reaching they were right from the get-go.
So they weren't messing around.
No, not at all.
They were moving serious weight and weren't afraid to use force to protect their business.
Right.
There are even stories about Sly Green himself getting into these crazy high-speed chases with rivals,
Yeah.
trying to jump into their cars in the middle of it all.
It's wild. That kind of audacity, that willingness to take huge risks. It's something you see a lot with people who rise to the top of criminal organizations. It takes a certain kind of mindset,
Yeah.
almost a disregard for the boundaries that most people wouldn't even think about crossing.
They operate on a different level.
For sure.
And it wasn't just Sly calling the shots.
Right.
His brother Clayton, who is known as Iceberg, was also a major player in the gang.
Oh, yeah, Iceberg.
Years later, Clayton was arrested in a police raid where they found a stash of cocaine.
Wow.
Which shows how deep that family was in that world.
It really makes you think about the influence of family and environment,
Yeah.
on a person's path.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the turning point in Sly Green's story. Because as high as they climbed, the fall was just as dramatic.
For sure. In 1991, Green was arrested on murder charges,
Oh, yeah.
which set the stage for his downfall.
Big time.
And while he was in jail awaiting trial, there's the story about him showing us your inmate newspaper clippings about his gang.
Oh, wow.
He was like, these are my guys. This is what they're doing, like with zero remorse.
That detail always stuck with me. It really shows how deeply ingrained his pride and his criminal enterprise was, even when he was facing serious charges. It's like foreshadowing his conviction.
And that conviction came in 1994.
Right.
Green, along with 27 other members of the LA Boys, were found guilty of racketeering, conspiracy, you name it.
Wow.
The trial even revealed that Green was planning to make a massive $50 million from cocaine deals.
$50 million. That's insane. That kind of ambition is fascinating.
Yeah.
But it makes you question the psychology behind it. What drives someone to go after that much wealth through illegal means?
Right. Is it pure greed, or are there other factors at play?
Yeah,
Green seemed to have that all-or-nothing mentality. He even tried to appeal the verdict
he did.
and extend his trial, but the judge wasn't having any of it.
No.
In the end, he was sentenced to 4 life sentences plus 110 years.
Wow.
Basically, game over.
It's a reminder that even the most powerful criminal empires eventually crumble. But here's where things take a really unexpected turn. Sly Green's story didn't end there,
What do you mean?
even though he's locked up for life.
Right.
His legacy is living on in a surprising place. Hip-hop music.
Wait, hold on. How did a convicted gangster end up in the world of hip-hop?
Well, there's this connection between Sly Green and 2 rappers who also came up in Buffalo.
Okay.
Westside Gunn and Benny the Butcher. Both of them had their own experiences in the drug game and started referencing Green in their music.
So these rappers are name-dropping a guy serving multiple life sentences.
They are. That seems unusual.
It is. And it's not just casual mentions either. Benny the Butcher actually has a song called Sly Green.
Wow.
And Westside Gunn included a Sly Green skit on his album Fly Why God.
Okay, now that's interesting.
Yeah.
It definitely blurs the lines between art and reality.
It does.
I'm curious to understand why they'd choose to feature someone like him so prominently in their music.
Right. It's a complex issue. On the one hand, you have this figure who is involved in a lot of illegal activities, but on the other hand, his story clearly resonates with these artists in a way that's shaping their music.
So it's almost like they're reclaiming their narrative.
Yeah.
Even if it involves a dark and controversial figure, they're saying this is where we came from. This is part of what shaped us.
Right. And it forces us as listeners to confront the complexities of storytelling. Who gets to tell these stories? And how do we navigate the moral ambiguity of figures like Sly Green?
Yeah, it's not about condoning his actions,
No.
but acknowledging the impact he had on their lives and on the city of Buffalo.
Exactly. It speaks to the power of music to connect with people on a visceral level, even when dealing with challenging subject matter.
For sure.
It can make us rethink our assumptions and biases.
This is making me think about hip-hop differently. It's not just entertainment.
Right?
It's social commentary,
Yeah,
a reflection of lived experiences that might not always be pretty.
that's a great point. It's something to keep in mind as you explore more music,
Yeah.
particularly hip-hop. Look for those layers of meaning, the stories behind the rhymes. It can really enrich your understanding.
I'm definitely going to pay closer attention. So what's the big takeaway here from our deep dive into Sly Green's world?
Well, I think it highlights this complex relationship between crime culture and artistic expression. We have to think critically about how we view Figures like Sly Green, how their stories are told and retold.
It's also a reminder that even behind bars, someone's influence can continue.
Absolutely. Especially if their story resonates with others.
Yeah,
Even if it's in a complicated way.
for sure. And in this case, that resonance found its way into hip-hop blurring the lines between reality and art, sparking these conversations about morality storytelling and the legacy of figures who have done both good and bad things.
And it's definitely made for a captivating deep dive, to say the least.
I agree. Sly Green's story is this captivating blend of ambition, violence, and this unexpected afterlife in music.
Right.
It's a story that lingers, prompting deeper thought.
It's interesting. We started this deep dive talking about Sly Green's daring jump into a rival's car during a chase.
Oh, yeah.
A pretty bold move for anyone.
Striking image of audacity.
And now, decades later, his voice makes another leap.
Right.
This time into the world of music. There's almost a poetic symmetry to it, don't you think?
I see what you mean.
Hmm.
It speaks to the lasting power of his story.
Yeah.
And the surprising ways it continues to captivate and challenge us, even if we grapple with the implications.
Yeah. It reminds us that the lines between fact and fiction, good and bad, can be blurry.
Yeah.
And sometimes the most compelling stories emerge from unexpected places, challenging our comfort zones.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And with that in mind, let's shift our focus to explore some of the specific examples of how Sly Green's presence is felt in hip-hop.
Yes. Let's delve into the music itself and see how these artists are incorporating his story and voice into their work. It's almost like he's become this, larger-than-life figure,
It is fascinating, isn't it?
Even though he's physically confined.
It makes you wonder what draws artists to a figure like Sly Green, someone convicted of serious crimes.
Right.
Is it purely for shock value?
Right.
Or is there a deeper connection there?
Yeah, I'm leaning towards there being something more to it.
Yeah.
I mean, to feature his voice on a whole EP,
Right.
that's not just a casual shout-out. That's a statement.
It's definitely a statement.
Yeah.
And remember, West Side Gun and Benny the Butcher, they grew up in Buffalo.
Right.
They saw the LA boys rise and fall firsthand. Their music is often rooted in those experiences. And Sly Green becomes a symbol of that era,
Right.
a part of their history they're trying to process through their art.
So it's almost like they're reclaiming their narrative,
Yeah,
even if it involves a dark and controversial figure.
exactly.
They're saying, this is where we came from. This is part of what shaped us.
Right. And it forces us as listeners to confront the complexities of storytelling. Who gets to tell these stories, and how do we navigate the moral ambiguity of figures like Sly Green?
It's not about condoning his actions,
No.
but acknowledging the impact he had on their lives and the city of Buffalo.
Exactly. It speaks to the power of music to connect with people on a visceral level. Even when dealing with challenging subject matter, it can make us rethink our assumptions and biases.
This is making me think about hip-hop differently. It's not just entertainment, it's social commentary.
Right.
A reflection of lived experiences that might not always be pretty.
That's a great point. And it's something to keep in mind as you explore more music, particularly hip-hop. Look for those layers of meaning, the stories behind the rhymes. It could really enrich your understanding.
I'm definitely going to pay closer attention. So what's the big takeaway here from our deep dive into Sly Green's world?
Well, I think it highlights this complex relationship between crime culture and artistic expression.
Okay.
We have to think critically about how we view figures like Sly Green, how their stories are told and retold.
It's also a reminder that even behind bars, someone's influence can continue.
Absolutely.
Especially if their story resonates with others.
Right.
Even if it's in a complicated way.
Exactly. And in this case, that resonance found its way into hip-hop, blurring the lines between reality and art.
Yeah.
Sparking these conversations about morality storytelling and the legacy of figures who have done both good and bad things.
It's definitely been a captivating deep dive, to say the least.
I agree. Sly Green's story is a captivating blend of ambition, violence, and this unexpected afterlife in music. Yeah.
It's a story that lingers.
Right.
Prompting deeper thought.
It's interesting. We started this deep dive talking about Sly Green's daring jump into a rival's car during a chase.
Oh, yeah.
A pretty bold move for anyone.
Yes, a striking image of audacity.
And now, decades later, his voice makes another leap, this time into the world of music.
Right.
There's almost a poetic symmetry to it, don't you think?
I see what you mean. It speaks to the lasting power of his story and the surprising ways it continues to captivate and challenge us, even if we grapple with the implications.
It reminds us that the lines between fact and fiction, good and bad, can be blurry.
Yeah.
And sometimes the most compelling stories emerge from unexpected places challenging our comfort zones.
That's a great point. And with that in mind, let's shift our focus to explore some of the specific examples of how Sly Green's presence is felt in hip-hop.
Yes, let's delve into the music itself and see how these artists are incorporating his story and voice into their work. So we talked about Sly Green and these two rappers, but what does it actually sound like?
How are West Side Gun and Benny the Butcher using him in their music?
That's where it gets really interesting. When you listen to their tracks, you realize they're not glorifying a criminal.
Okay.
They're using his story to explore deeper themes, like poverty ambition, the allure and consequences of street life. It's like they're holding up a mirror to a specific part of American culture.
So it's more about using his story as a springboard for social commentary than just like a straight-up tribute.
Exactly. Take Benny the Butcher's song, Sly Green. It's gritty and raw and doesn't shy away from the violence that was part of Green's world.
Right.
But it also hints at those systemic factors that might lead someone down that path. Lack of opportunity, the cycle of poverty, the allure of quick money.
Right.
It's nuanced, thought-provoking stuff.
And what about West Side Gun?
Yeah.
He seems to have taken this connection even further by featuring Sly Green's voice on his EP.
Yeah, and that's where it gets really fascinating.
Right.
The way they've incorporated his voice on 11 is almost haunting. It's not like he's rapping or giving interviews. It's more like snippets of conversations, reflections, almost like a ghost from the past commenting on the present.
That sounds incredibly powerful.
It is.
I imagine it adds a whole other layer of depth to the music.
It does. It gives you this sense of history repeating itself,
Yeah.
of the past reaching out and touching the present.
Right.
It makes you think about the lasting impact of choices, both for the individual and for the community.
Yeah, it also challenges the simple narrative of like good guy versus bad guy.
It does.
You have a convicted criminal's voice woven into the music.
Right.
It makes you confront the complexities of his story.
And I think that's one of the most intriguing aspects of this whole thing. It goes beyond a simple celebration or condemnation. It's about acknowledging the nuance, the gray areas, the fact that even someone who committed terrible acts can still have a story that makes you think.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that music can be an incredible vehicle for exploring these tough topics.
Absolutely.
It can spark a dialogue, make us question our assumptions, and broaden our understanding of the world.
This deep dive into Sly Green's story has taken us from the streets of Buffalo to the world of hip-hop, highlighting how crime culture and art are all connected.
It's been a thought-provoking journey. We've seen how a notorious gangster's legacy lives on in music.
Yeah.
It's made us think about storytelling, the lines between glorification and social commentary, and the power of music
Right.
to make us think critically about the world.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this such a compelling story.
Yeah.
It challenges us to look beyond the surface and grapple with some uncomfortable truths.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
we encourage you to check out the music of West Side Gun and Benny the Butcher.
Yeah.
Listen to how they use Sly Green's story in their work and think about what it means to you. Does it glorify him,
Right.
criticize him, or something else entirely?
Because the important thing is that you're engaging with these complex issues.
Right.
Asking questions and forming your own opinions.
And that's what the deep dive is all about. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
All right, diving into a fascinating figure today. We got a ton of stuff about Felix Mitchell, and honestly, it's more than just your average gangster story. Thousands at his funeral, horse-drawn carriage, 14 Rolls Royces. It's wild.
It's definitely not your typical send-off, that's for sure.
It makes you wonder, what's the real story here? Was he some kind of community hero, or was it just a glamorized, glorification of crime?
That's what we're going to try to figure out. It's a lot more complicated than it seems. I mean, to even begin to understand that funeral, you really got to go back, look at Mitchell's whole life.
Okay, so let's rewind. We got all this material you sent.
Yeah.
And it's like Oakland in the 60s and 70s, poverty, no opportunities.
Right, a breeding ground almost. And there's young Felix Mitchell right in the middle of it all.
Born 54, right?
Yeah, born and raised in Oakland, grew up in the project San Antonio Village, if I remember correctly, drops out of high school, starts this group that turns into, well, the 69 mob.
Yeah, infamous.
And get this, he wasn't just some small-time hood. He had connections all over L.A., even Detroit.
Wow, so this was organized, thought out. He had big plans, clearly.
Definitely ambitious. And we got to remember, this was before crack. Heroin was the big thing back then. Mitchell, he saw an opening, a way to make a name for himself.
So how did he get so powerful so fast? There's got to be more to it.
Well, from what I gathered, seems he hooked up with this LA kingpin, Tootie Reese.
Reese.
Yeah, already had a huge network in the Bay Area and beyond. So kind of like a mentor, I guess you could say, in the drug world.
Ah, that explains it.
Mitchell, he was in the thick of it. Turf wars all the time, rival gangs, Mickey Moore's crew, Funktown, USA. Super violent stuff.
So we've got Felix the cat.
Oh, yeah, that nickname.
It does add this whole other layer to it all, doesn't it? Like cartoonish, but he's running this giant heroin ring.
$5 million a year, some estimates say.
5 million.
That buys you a lot of power influence. But it also makes you a target. That's where things start to unravel, I guess.
Leads to the downfall, right? 1985, cops finally catch up to him.
Yep. Arrested, convicted, life sentence, off to Leavenworth.
Typical story for a guy like that, you'd think.
You'd think, except here's where it gets really weird.
Weird how?
Just over a year later, 2 days shy of his 32nd birthday, Mitchell's killed in prison. Stabbed.
Oh, wow. Tragic, but I guess not totally surprising, given, the life.
Yeah. But then you get to the funeral, and that's when things get really interesting.
Thousands of people, horse-drawn carriage, all those Rolls Royces. You said it before, not your typical send-off. Almost felt more like a celebration.
It did, didn't it? And then you add Huey P. Newton into the mix.
Black Panther Party co-founder. What was he doing at a drug lord's funeral?
Right. Adds another layer of complexity to it all. Why would someone like that, such a prominent figure, be there?
Yeah. I mean, on the one hand, you have this huge outpouring of respect, almost worship. But on the other, wasn't it, I don't know, kind of dangerous?
Yeah.
Sending a mixed message, especially to young people who maybe saw him as a role model. How do you even start to make sense of that? It's almost like a legend, His death, the funeral, the whole thing. But hold on, we got to talk about this other crazy twist. His conviction, it gets overturned, right?
A year after his death, yeah. He died before they could hear his appeal. So, legally speaking, he wasn't a criminal anymore.
So officially, he died an innocent man. Talk about a bizarre turn of events. But even if his name was cleared, his impact on Oakland, especially on the criminal side of things, that doesn't just disappear, right?
Exactly. And this is where we get to this thing called the Felix Mitchell paradox. You'd figure take out a major player like Mitchell, crime goes down. But that's not what happened at all.
Wait, hold up. It actually increased after he was gone. I don't get it. How does that even work?
Imagine it like, a dam holding back a flood. Mitchell, his control, his grip on everything, it kept a weird sort of balance, a monopoly on violence almost. Brutal, but it kind of worked. Take him out of the picture, the dam breaks. Chaos everywhere, all these smaller gangs fighting for scraps.
So his power, it actually stabilized things.
Yeah.
That's kind of mind-blowing.
It really goes against everything we think we know about crime. You'd think just locking up the big guy solves everything. But the Felix Mitchell paradox, it shows us that's not enough. You got to deal with the root causes. The poverty, no jobs, the cycle of violence.
It's way more complicated than just bad guy goes to jail, happy ending. Huh?
Way more. But it still leaves us with this puzzle. Felix the cat. Criminal mastermind. Just a product of his environment. Was he both? I mean, he did have that Robin Hood image, giving back to the community, those huge parties he'd throw for the kids, even paying people's rent sometimes, buying groceries.
Right, those parties were legendary, weren't they? Like, he was flaunting his success, but also sharing it.
Yeah.
Even if the money came from, well.
Yeah. Exactly. Fueled that Robin Hood image.
Yeah.
But we can't forget the damage. The drug trade, the lives lost, families destroyed.
It's a tough one. We're trying to fit these two extremes together. Community leader, drug lord.
You've hit it, Mitchell. He's not black and white. All these contradictions, that's what makes him so fascinating.
So what does it all mean for us now? His story's a mess of contradictions. What are we supposed to learn from it?
I think it shows us that things are rarely simple. It's a reminder, Look for the nuances, people, situations. They're rarely just good or bad. And the solutions, those aren't always clear-cut either.
Getting rid of a kingpin, that's a headline. But it doesn't magically fix a broken system. We got to tackle the big stuff. Poverty, inequality, the lack of opportunity. That's where guys like Mitchell come from.
You got it. And maybe his story can make us think differently about the stories we tell about crime, about poverty. It's easy to judge, slap a label on someone, hero or villain. But Mitchell, he shows us those labels don't tell the whole story.
So we've gone deep on Felix Mitchell, and we're left with a lot to think about. This paradox, that funeral. A snapshot of a man, a community, fighting forces bigger than them.
And for you listening, here's a final thought. If Mitchell's conviction was overturned, does that change how you see him? Was he just a victim of his circumstances who found power in a bad way? Or did he take advantage of those circumstances?
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. Makes you think about what making it really means, especially when the system is, you know, stacked against you.
For sure. And that's where I think Mitchell's story gets really interesting. It ties into all these bigger issues. Social mobility, inequality, that whole idea of getting rich quick, even if it's not exactly legal.
Right, because for a guy like Mitchell, growing up poor, violence everywhere, maybe the right way just wasn't an option, you know? So he makes his own rules, his own way, even if it means breaking the law.
Yeah, it's like the ends justify the means, right? But Mitchell's story, it shows what happens. Those means, they come back to haunt you. Violence, chaos, it affects everyone for years.
Which brings us back to that funeral. The spectacle. The message it sent. What do you think it says about Mitchell's place in Oakland?
Honestly, I think it shows just how much confusion, how much uncertainty there was, even within his own community. Some people, they genuinely mourned him. They saw him as a leader, someone who took care of them. But for others, there had to be this unease. Like, yeah, he did some good, but look at the cost.
Almost like the community itself was torn. They lost someone who, in his own twisted way, brought some order. But they knew he was also responsible for so much darkness.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole thing so captivating. There are no easy answers. It forces you to confront the hard truths about ourselves, about society.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, we're left with this question. How do we remember Felix Mitchell? Criminal mastermind, folk hero, something else entirely?
That's up to each of us to figure out. But I hope, that this has made you curious. To dig deeper, look past the simple explanations. It's a fascinating chapter in Oakland's history, even if it's a tragic one.
And to everyone listening, keep digging, read those sources, find different viewpoints, and come to your own conclusions about the Felix Mitchell paradox. What does it tell us about crime, poverty, about what it means to be human? Until next time, happy diving.